Karen's voice sliced through the recruitment office like a dull knife. Loud and grating. Some people shouldn't even be here. She huffed, her chins wobbling as she glared at the woman ahead of her in line. The air was thick with tension, the kind that makes you hold your breath and pray for silence. But Karen, in her oversized floral blouse and self-righteous smirk, wasn't one for subtlety. She thrived on making others squirm. And today, her target was a woman with a scar that ran like a jagged river across her cheek. The scarred woman didn't flinch. She stood ramrod straight, her eyes fixed on the recruitment desk ahead, clutching a folder of documents. Her jacket was faded, but her posture screamed discipline. Karen, however, saw only weakness. I mean, look at her, she continued, loud enough for the whole room to hear. What's someone like that doing in a place like this? This is for real soldiers. Not whatever she is. A nervous chuckle escaped one of the other recruits. A lanky young man who immediately regretted it when the scarred woman's gaze flickered toward him. Calm but piercing. The recruitment office was a sterile box of linoleum and fluorescent lights, filled with the hum of anxious anticipation. Two other recruits stood in line. A wiry woman with glasses and a stocky man who kept checking his watch. They shuffled their feet, avoiding Karen's tirade. The clerk at the desk, a tired-looking sergeant, pretended not to hear, but his pen paused mid-signature. Karen's voice was a storm, and everyone else was just trying to stay dry. Karen leaned closer to the scarred woman, her breath heavy with the scent of cheap coffee. You know, they don't just let anyone in the army. You gotta have, like, actual skills. Not just scars. She smirked, expecting a reaction, maybe tears or a hurried exit. But the scarred woman didn't budge. She turned her head slightly, just enough to meet Karen's eyes, and said nothing. Her silence was louder than Karen's insults, and it infuriated her. What? You deaf too? Karen snapped, her voice climbing. Or just too dumb to know you don't belong here? The lanky recruit coughed, trying to hide a laugh, but the wiry woman with glasses shot him a look that could have stopped a tank. The room felt smaller, the air heavier, as Karen's words hung like smoke. Then the door at the far end of the office swung open, and a man in a crisp general's uniform stepped through. His presence was a shockwave, silencing the room instantly. The clerk snapped to attention, and the recruits straightened. Even Karen, though her scowl lingered. The general's eyes scanned the line, his face unreadable but commanding. He carried a clipboard, and his boots clicked sharply against the floor as he approached. Captain Ellison, he said, his voice low but clear, directed at the scarred woman. Every head in the room turned. Karen's smirk froze, then melted into something like confusion. The scarred woman stepped forward, her movements precise, and saluted. Sir, she replied, her voice steady, almost soft, but with an edge that cut through the room's tension. Karen's mouth opened, then closed, like a fish gasping for air. The general didn't even glance at her. Captain, your paperwork is in order. We're ready for your briefing on the new training protocols. Your experience in Kandahar will be invaluable. He handed her a folder, his tone professional but warm with respect. The room was a graveyard of silence. The lanky recruit's face burned red, and the wiry woman's eyes widened behind her glasses. Karen, however, looked like she'd been slapped. Her cheeks puffed out, her eyes darting between the general and the woman she'd just mocked. Captain, she muttered, barely audible, but the word dripped with disbelief. Captain Ellison nodded to the general, then turned to Karen. Her scarred face was calm, but her eyes held a fire that made Karen take a step back. "You were saying?" Ellison asked, her voice quiet but laced with steel. It wasn't a question that needed an answer. Karen's face went pale, her bravado crumbling like cheap plaster. The general raised an eyebrow, sensing the tension. "Is there a problem here?" he asked, his gaze settling on Karen. The clerk, who'd been silent until now, cleared his throat. "Ma'am was questioning the captain's qualifications." "Sir," he said, his tone neutral but his eyes gleaming with something like amusement. Karen sputtered. "Two didn't know?" "I mean," she didn't look like. She stopped herself, realizing every word was digging her deeper. The general's expression didn't change, but his voice grew colder. "The Army doesn't judge on looks, ma'am. It judges on service. Something you might want to consider before speaking again." The other recruits shifted uncomfortably, their eyes glued to the floor. Karen's hands clenched into fists, her face a mix of embarrassment and defiance. She wasn't used to being called out, let alone humiliated in front of strangers. But Captain Ellison didn't linger on the moment. She tucked the folder under her arm and followed the general toward the briefing room, her scarred cheek catching the light as she passed. There was no gloating, no petty victory lap, just the quiet dignity of someone who'd faced worse than Karen's words and come out stronger. Karen stood frozen, her mouth twitching as if searching for something to say. The wiry woman with glasses finally spoke, her voice barely above a whisper. "Maybe next time. Keep your opinions to yourself." The stocky man nodded, his watch forgotten. Karen shot them a glare, but it lacked her earlier venom. She was shrinking, her confidence leaking out like air from a punctured tire. As the door closed behind Captain Ellison and the general, the clerk returned to his paperwork, but not before muttering, "Some people learn the hard way." The lanky recruit let out a nervous laugh, then clamped his mouth shut when Karen's head whipped toward him. She grabbed her purse, muttering something about unfair treatment, and stormed toward the exit. The door slammed behind her, but no one flinched. The room felt lighter without her. Outside, Karen fumbled with her car keys, her face still flushed. She'd come to the recruitment office to sign up, convinced she'd be a shoo-in, a natural leader. She'd pictured herself barking orders, respected and feared. Instead, she'd been exposed as a bully, her arrogance laid bare in front of strangers and a decorated officer. The irony was bitter. She'd mocked a woman for her appearance, only to be humbled by her own lack of character. Captain Ellison, meanwhile, sat in the briefing room, her scarred face illuminated by the projector's glow. She spoke of strategy, of sacrifice, of lessons learned in the dust and chaos of war. The general listened intently, nodding as she outlined her plans. Her scar wasn't a flaw, it was a badge, earned in a firefight that saved her unit. She didn't need to prove herself to anyone, least of all Karen. Her record spoke louder than any insult. Back in the recruitment office, the wiry woman and the stocky man exchanged glances. "That was something," the woman said, adjusting her glasses. The man nodded. "Yeah. Makes you think twice about judging people." The lanky recruit stayed silent, his earlier laughter replaced by a thoughtful frown. The clerk, still scribbling, smirked to himself. He'd seen people like Karen before, loud until they were outmatched, bold until they were exposed. Karen's car peeled out of the parking lot, her hands shaking on the wheel. She'd never return to that office. never faced the people who'd seen her unravel. But the lesson lingered. Sharp and unforgiving, words have weight. And ignorance has consequences. She'd mocked a hero, assuming she was less. And the truth had hit her like a freight train. Her pride was bruised. Her ego shattered. And for once, she had no one to blame but herself. The world didn't stop for Karen's humiliation. Captain Ellison's briefing went on, shaping the future of the recruits who'd follow her lead. The office hummed with new applicants, new stories, new chances to learn. And somewhere, in the quiet corners of that sterile room, the echo of Karen's mistake served as a warning: judge others at your peril. Because you never know who's standing in line. The end.